I went north for seasonal fishing because I needed the money, and because I wanted to see a part of Alaska that people talked about in a careful way. A friend of a friend needed help running nets on the Yukon before freeze up. I had worked rivers before, but never that far inland, never that late in the year. Late October felt like borrowed time. Every morning carried the sense that winter was standing just out of sight. We flew into a small village, and then went upriver by skiff. The river was wide and slow in places, then narrow and fast where it bent around long gravel bars. The banks were already locked in frost. Willow leaves lay flat and black against the mud. The air had a dry edge that burned the nose. Ice clung to the shaded edges and made thin plates that clicked together when the current pushed them free. The people who lived there kept warning me about false skin. Ice that forms on top while the water underneath keeps moving. From above it looks solid. From below it is alive. They told me it could hold snow, and even hold a man for a step or two before breaking. They said the river takes things quietly that time of year. No thrashing, no noise, just a sudden absence. We set up a small camp along a bend with a low-cut bank. The skiff was tied off to a tree with a line that stayed stiff even in daylight. At night the temperature dropped hard. The river steamed in places. Nets went out before dark and came in at first light. Fish were still moving, slow and heavy, their bodies already firm with cold. The first 2 nights were uneventful. The river groaned and cracked as ice shifted. Wind came down the channel and carried the smell of wet leaves and old fish. On the 3rd night I woke to a change in sound. Not loud, just wrong. The skiff was tied off tight, but something was pressing against it from below. The hull did not slap the water. There was no splash. The pressure came up through the floor like a slow shove. It eased off, then came back, stronger, as if whatever it was had learned where to push. I sat up in my bag and listened. The line creaked. The skiff shifted an inch, then settled. The water around it stayed smooth. No ripples spread out. The sound was dull, like knuckles against wood, but muffled by depth. I told myself it was ice moving under the surface. I told myself it was debris, a log caught in the current. None of those thoughts sat right. It happened again. A steady push that lifted the bow just enough to tighten the line. The engine was cold and silent. The smell of fuel hung in the air from the last run. The river kept its surface calm, as if nothing touched it. I did not get out of the bag. I did not reach for a light. I stayed still and counted breaths. The pressure came and went for a long time. There was a pattern to it, spaced out, patient. It stopped before dawn. In the morning the river looked unchanged. Thin ice had formed along the edge overnight, clear and smooth. We went to check the bank where the skiff had been tied. Along the new ice were marks pressed up from below. They looked like handprints at first glance, spread wide, fingers splayed. They were too long. The joints showed in the wrong places. There were more of them than made sense, overlapping, trailing along the edge as if something had moved beneath the ice and tested it again and again. The explanation offered was river suction or otter trails. Both were possible. Otters do slide under ice and push up for air. Suction does strange things where the current hits a cut bank. I knew those facts. Still, the prints were not slides. They were not smooth. They showed pressure points, like something pushing up slowly and feeling its way along. We reset the nets without talking. The day stayed gray and low. Snow flurries came and went. By afternoon the temperature dropped again, and the ice thickened enough to carry a thin skin of snow. The river looked safer than it was. That night the engine was left running. The vibration carried through the hull and into the bank. The sound filled the space that had been quiet before. Exhaust hung low and sharp. I slept in short stretches, waking to check the line and the ice. Nothing touched the skiff. The engine burned fuel and time. In the dark hours before morning, I thought about what could have been under us. Not something unknown, just things people do not like to picture. Large fish move late in the season. They follow deep channels and rest under ice. Beavers build lodges and drag branches underwater. They have strong forelimbs and long fingers. They test ice and banks from below. A beaver pushed into a hull would feel like a careful shove. Multiple animals working a lodge could leave marks that overlap. I also thought about anchor ice. Supercooled water forms ice on the riverbed and lifts debris when it breaks free. It can rise in sheets and press against anything in its path. A slab of it could lift a skiff without breaking the surface, then settle back down. It could push along the bank and leave impressions where it met thinner ice. The joints could be fractures in the forming ice, not fingers at all, just the mind trying to make sense of shapes. At first light we left. The nets stayed where they were. Ice had already started to lock them in. The skiff broke through thin plates as we moved out, the sound sharp and final. We did not look back at the bank. The engine ran hard until the river widened and the current smoothed out. On the way downriver, I watched the water closely. In one bend the surface sagged and lifted without breaking, a slow breath. In another spot a dark shape moved under the ice and vanished. These were normal things for a river in late October. Knowing that did not make them easier to watch. We reached the village by afternoon. The temperature kept falling. By the next morning the river was closing fast. The nets would be lost until spring, frozen in place, fish and all. Later, after I went home, I asked questions. I read reports and talked to people who had worked that stretch for decades. The explanations lined up. Late-season beaver activity increases as they rush to secure food. They work under ice and test structures. Anchor ice events are common during sudden cold snaps. They can lift boats and leave strange marks along banks when they surge and break. False skin hides all of it until something touches it. Nothing supernatural was required. The river itself was enough. Cold water moves with weight and patience. Animals use it as cover. Ice forms and breaks in ways that confuse the eye. That combination creates moments that feel watched and tested, even when no mind is behind it. What stayed with me was not fear of the unknown. It was the understanding that the river did not care whether I understood it. It would do what it does every year. It would freeze, shift, lift, and take. We left when it told us to leave, and that was the only reason we were able to explain the story at all. September in the interior feels like the land holding its breath. The bugs thin out. The nights sharpen. The ground starts to lock up under the moss. That year was 1997. I was in my early 30s and had lived most of my life in Alaska. I had hunted moose since I was a teenager. I knew the country. I knew how sound traveled in spruce and alder. I knew what animals left what sign. I knew how far a man could walk in a day and what it did to your legs and your head. There were 3 of us. No names matter now. We were careful and sober about it. No bravado. No drinking. We carried good rifles and backup handguns. We carried maps and compasses and extra food. We went off trail by choice because that was how you found animals that had not been pushed around. We planned to stay 10 days. We planned to pack meat by hand, if we were lucky. We were strong enough then. The first day was clean. Cold air in the lungs. Boots sinking into moss that smelled like iron and rot. We cut inland from a river bend and climbed into rolling hills broken by black spruce and open bog. Moose sign was everywhere. Old beds. Fresh droppings. Trails worn into the willows. The place felt right. Late that afternoon I noticed tracks that did not belong to us. They were not moose. They were not bear. They were barefoot. Long narrow. Toes pressed deep. Heel clear. No claw marks. They ran parallel to our line of travel about 20 yards out, never cutting across where we had walked. They matched our stride length too well. When we stopped to glass, they stopped. When we moved, they continued. At first I told myself it was just old sign, and my mind lining it up where it did not belong. I have hunted long enough to know your brain can lie to you when you want a pattern. But these were fresh. The edges were sharp. Moss fibers were torn and still green. We did not say anything out loud. We all saw them. You can tell when other men are seeing the same thing because they slow down in the same way and start scanning without comment. That night we made camp early in a stand of spruce near a small rise. We cleared brush, set a tight perimeter, hung food, stacked rifles where they could be reached without fumbling. We cooked fast and ate without talking much. The woods settled. Wind died. Stars came out hard and bright. Nothing happened that night. No noise. No movement. Still, none of us slept deep. The second day we pushed farther north into rougher ground. The tracks stayed with us. Always off to the side. Always just outside where you would step if you drifted. They never crossed ours. They never cut ahead. They never lagged. It was like someone walking beside a fence line, keeping pace without touching it. I studied them closely whenever I could. The weight was wrong for a child. The stride was too long. The foot had a shape I could not place. The ball pressed hard, as if whoever it was leaned forward when they walked. There were times when the track sank deeper than ours, even when the ground was firm. That bothered me more than anything else. We found a good meadow that afternoon with fresh moose sign, and decided to stay. We built camp tighter than before. We cut shooting lanes. We marked ranges. We kept watch in turns without saying that was what we were doing. The third night came cold. Frost crept across the ground before dark. The sky stayed clear. Around midnight a sound came from the ridge above us. It started low then rose. It was a scream, but not like any animal I knew. It held shape. It did not waver or break the way fear sounds break. It was steady, measured, like someone testing how far they could push their voice. It cut off clean. A pause followed. Then it started again, a little different, like it was adjusting. The pitch shifted. The length changed. It felt deliberate. One of my friends fired into the dark. Not a warning shot. He emptied the rifle. The flashes lit trees and smoke and drifting needles. The echo rolled away. When the last shot faded, the sound stopped. No crashing retreat. No movement. Just silence. None of us slept after that. We watched the trees until the sky lightened. In the morning we checked the perimeter. The tracks were inside it. They circled the camp slowly. They came close to where we slept. Close enough that if someone had reached out, they could have touched a boot. There were no signs of struggle. No sign of a rush. Just those prints, calm and patient. We broke camp without discussion. We left meat we had cut from a small bull the day before. We left gear that would have slowed us down. We carried only what we needed to move fast and stay armed. We chose a line that cut straight back toward the river, through the worst ground, because we did not want to follow any trail we had made. The tracks followed us again. They stayed farther out now, but they were still there. When we slowed, they slowed. When we pushed hard, they pushed hard. Once, crossing a patch of gravel near a dry creek, I saw them clearly in full daylight. The shape was wrong. The toes were long and spread. The heel was narrow. There was a slight drag at the front, as if the foot lifted late. Late that afternoon the weather turned. Clouds rolled in low and gray. Wind picked up. The woods started to sound alive again, branches rubbing, needles hissing. The scream did not come back. Instead there were smaller sounds. Footsteps that stopped when we stopped. A weight shifting in brush just out of sight. We reached the river at dusk. We did not stop. We crossed cold and fast, water up to our thighs, rifles held high. On the far bank we climbed, without looking back, until our lungs burned. The tracks ended at the river. We did not camp that night. We walked until dawn and then some. When we finally stopped, it was in a place with open sight lines and no cover. Nothing followed us there. We got out 2 days later. None of us talked much on the drive. Back in town, the normal sounds felt wrong. Engines, voices, doors closing. It took time for my hands to stop shaking. I spent weeks afterward going over it in my head, trying to fit it into something that made sense. I read everything I could about animal behavior. I talked to biologists I knew without telling them the whole story. I thought about people living off-grid. I thought about hunters playing games. Nothing fit. What followed us did not act like an animal. Predators test, but they rush when they commit. Prey flees. This stayed measured. It learned. The scream was not rage or fear. It was practice. The tracks never crossed ours because it did not want to be seen directly. It stayed just far enough to watch. When shots were fired, it did not panic. It adjusted. I believe now that it was a person, not a monster, not something from stories. A person who lived far out and had learned to move that way. Someone who knew the land better than we did and wanted us gone without risking a fight. Someone who understood sound and fear and patience. That explanation does not make it better. It makes it worse. Interior Alaska is big, but it is not empty. There are places where people go because they do not want to be found, and places where others learn to survive without needing anything from outside. If someone like that decided you were a problem, they would not need to touch you to end your hunt. We never reported it. There was nothing to report. Tracks wash away. Sounds leave no mark. We just stopped hunting. Every one of us. I still go outside. I still hike and fish. But I do not go off trail anymore. I do not camp deep. And when I hear something that sounds almost like a voice where there should be none, I leave without trying to understand it. I moved to Nome in November of 2005 because the school district needed a middle school science teacher, and I needed a job that would keep me steady for more than a year. I had grown up in the lower 48 and thought I understood winter. I did not. Nome in November felt like the edge of something unfinished. The daylight was already thin and brittle. The air near the docks carried salt, fuel, and old fish. Everything creaked or hummed or went quiet at once. Housing was scarce. People warned me about that before I arrived. I took what I could get, which was a single room in an old boarding house 2 blocks from the water. The building had once served dock workers and seasonal labor. By 2005 it held teachers, a nurse, 2 men who worked at the power plant, and a few people who drifted in and out. The exterior siding had peeled to gray. The steps were worn into shallow curves. The hallway carpet smelled faintly damp even though it looked dry. My room was narrow but clean. 1 bed, 1 desk, 1 window that faced a chain-link fence, and a pile of crab pots stacked like rusted cages. The radiator knocked at night. The doorframe was thick wood with layers of paint. The lock was old but solid. I told myself that I could live with noise and cold. I told myself that this was temporary. The first night I woke at exactly 2:17 in the morning. I did not know the time until I checked the clock. I woke because I heard weight in the hallway. Not a shuffle, not a scrape. Each step landed flat and heavy. There was a rhythm to it, slow and careful, as if whoever walked was counting the distance between steps. The sound moved down the hall and stopped outside my door. I held my breath without deciding to. The steps paused for several seconds. Then they moved on. I assumed it was someone going to the bathroom. The boarding house had shared facilities at the end of the hall. Old pipes moaned. Floors settled. I fell back asleep. The next night it happened again. Same time. Same pace. Same pause. I woke before the sound reached my door, as if my body had learned the schedule before my mind accepted it. When the steps stopped outside my room, I stared at the door handle and waited for it to turn. It did not. After a short stillness, the steps continued. By the 4th night, I was watching the clock before falling asleep. At 2:16, my heart rate climbed. At 2:17, the steps began. The sound was too deliberate to belong to a sleepwalker. It was not random. It did not change speed. It did not hesitate except at my door. I listened for breathing or fabric movement. I heard none. Only the weight of feet and the quiet of the building holding its shape. During the day, the boarding house felt ordinary. People came and went. Someone cooked eggs in the shared kitchen. Someone else left boots by the radiator to dry. The landlord lived on the 1st floor. He was a thin man with pale eyebrows and a habit of clearing his throat before speaking. I mentioned the noise in passing. He said the building settled at night and the cold made the wood contract. He said the hallway carried sound. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. I was new. I was alone. I did not want to be the person who made trouble over normal things. The footsteps continued every night. I tried leaving my lamp on. I tried sleeping with the radio playing low. The steps cut through both. They always stopped outside my door. They never touched the handle. The pause never lasted more than half a minute. I counted once. 32 seconds. I began to notice other details. The hallway smelled sharper at night, like cold metal. The air under my door felt colder after the pause, as if someone stood there long enough to block warmth. In the morning there were no marks on the carpet. No scuffs. No displaced dust. One evening I came home early from school because a storm had moved in fast. Snow blew sideways. The docks disappeared behind white sheets. I unlocked my door and stepped into my room and felt a tightness in my chest before I understood why. The bedspread was rumpled in a way it had not been when I left. The mattress dipped near the foot of the bed, compressed deeply, as if someone had sat there for a long time. The pillow had shifted toward the wall. My door was unlocked. I stood there without moving. The air smelled faintly of wet wool and something sour. I checked the window. It was locked. I checked the closet. Nothing inside but my coat and boots. I checked under the bed. Dust. A dropped pencil. No footprints. I remade the bed and sat on the edge to prove to myself that I could. The mattress gave under my weight in a familiar way, not like the long depression I had found. I locked the door and pushed a chair under the handle. I did not leave the room again that night. The footsteps came at 2:17. They stopped outside my door. The handle did not move. The chair stayed in place. The steps moved on. I began sleeping with my light on and my shoes beside the bed. I kept my coat ready. I memorized the sound of the landlord's gate during the day. It did not match what I heard at night. He walked faster and lighter. He cleared his throat. The night steps never did. I asked another tenant if they heard the hallway at night. They said the building was noisy and shrugged. No one else mentioned a pause. No one else complained. A week later the power went out during a storm. It was not unusual. The town had outages when ice loaded the lines. This one lasted several hours. The The boarding house went dark and cold. Emergency lights flickered in the hall and then died. I lay awake listening to the wind hit the building in waves. The footsteps came anyway. I could not see the hallway light under my door because there was none. I could only hear the wait and the stop. The next morning the landlord mentioned the outage had reminded him of an old winter. He spoke about it without looking at me. He said a former tenant had frozen to death in the hallway during a blackout years before I moved in. The man had been drinking. He got disoriented. He sat down to rest and never stood up again. They found him against the wall, hands at his waist, nails broken, skin torn where he tried to pull himself up when the cold set in. I did not ask questions. I did not need details. Later that day I looked closely at my doorframe. At waist height, beneath layers of paint, there were shallow grooves. Fingernail marks filled with old dust. They were not fresh. They were not obvious unless you knew to look. That night I did not sleep. The steps came. They paused. I imagined a person standing there in the dark, confused, cold, resting their weight where they had once rested before. I imagined a habit formed by exhaustion and alcohol and pain. I imagined the building remembering where someone had stopped, the way floors remember furniture. I left Nome 2 days later. I broke my lease and packed what I could fit in my car. I told the school district I could not stay. I did not wait for the next storm. Years later, with distance and warmer air, I understand what likely happened. The boarding house sat near the docks where men worked late and drank hard. The landlord had keys. He checked the building at night during outages and storms. Someone else, another tenant or a friend of a tenant, had probably mistaken my room for their own more than once. The compressed bed could have been a man sitting down to wait for warmth, thinking he had found his place. The footsteps at the same time each night could have been the landlord making rounds on a rigid schedule, stopping where trouble had once occurred. The pause outside my door could have been habit, not intent. None of that changes how it felt to live there, listening to weight approach in the dark and stop where I slept. None of it changes the marks in the wood, or the way the cold pressed under the door during those pauses. I do not believe in ghosts. I believe in people, in cold, in routine, and in buildings that hold the memory of bad nights long after the power comes back on. My name is Jonah, and this happened in December of 2020, in a part of Alaska that does not show up on most maps. The village had an airstrip carved into frozen ground, a straight black line edged with lights that looked temporary even though they had been there for years. I was trying to get out before a storm closed the region. Everyone else already had. The flight was a small supply plane that moved mail, fuel drums, and food more often than people. I was the last passenger booked on it. The storm was coming in from the west, heavy clouds stacked low and dense, the kind that flatten sound and make distance hard to judge. The plane was late. Not a few minutes late. Over an hour. By the time I arrived at the airstrip, the village felt empty in a way that did not feel natural. Houses were dark. No snowmobiles. No dogs. No smoke from chimneys. Even the wind felt held back. I remember standing near the edge of the cleared area and having the strong sense that the quiet had been arranged on purpose, like a stage set waiting for actors. The terminal building was a small metal box with a heater that clicked and struggled. The door was unlocked. The lights were on. No one inside. A clipboard sat on the counter with my name already checked off. That detail stuck with me. It meant someone had been there recently. They had expected me. Then they had left. Outside, the runway lights were on. Yellow and white bulbs marking the strip through snow and dark. Beyond them was nothing but flat ground and brush swallowed by winter. I stayed close to the building, hands in my pockets, listening for the sound of engines that did not come. After a while, I noticed movement near the far edge of the lights. At first I thought it was my eyes adjusting. Then I saw it again. Something moving just beyond where the light faded into dark. It moved in short bursts, stepping into the light, then slipping back out. It stayed low at first, then straightened. It was too fast to be someone walking at a normal pace. It crossed gaps between lights in a way that felt practiced. At the same time, it held itself upright in a way that did not fit any animal I knew. No loping. No head down. No pause to sniff or scan. I told myself it was a trick of contrast and cold. The mind fills gaps when it is tired and isolated. I watched longer, trying to find a pattern that would make it ordinary. The movement did not repeat. It did not come closer. It stayed at the edge, as if aware of the boundary the lights made. When the plane finally arrived, The sound came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The engines cut through the quiet, so hard it felt like pressure on my chest. The lights reflected off the fuselage as it rolled in. I felt relief that was almost physical. The pilot did not shut the engines down fully. The door opened. Cargo was already inside. I climbed the steps quickly, aware of the dark behind me. As I settled into the seat, I glanced back through the window. The movement was still there. The pilot kept his eyes forward. He did not turn his head. I noticed how tight his shoulders were, how his hands stayed locked on the controls even while waiting. At one point, he made a small motion with his head, a warning gesture without looking at me. I understood it as a clear instruction not to acknowledge anything outside, not with hands or body or attention. That was when the idea of waving crossed my mind, uninvited. A reflex. If there were people out there, it would be normal to signal. That thought scared me enough that I forced my hands flat against my legs. We waited longer than expected. The engine stayed running. The storm clouds crept closer, swallowing what little sky I could see through the windshield. The runway lights hummed. Beyond them, the movement stopped. Then I saw shapes. They were standing just past the lights now. Several of them. Not moving, not shifting weight. Just standing, spaced unevenly, facing the plane. I counted at least 8, possibly more. They were bundled in heavy winter gear, thick parkas and hoods. Their faces were dark, either covered or turned away from the light. What struck me was how still they were. No breath visible, no adjustment to the cold, no reaction to the noise of the engines. They stood as if placed there. The pilot made a small gesture near his chest, a motion that looked practiced and private. I recognized it later as a sign of protection, done without thought. He did not explain. I did not ask. The plane began to move. As we rolled down the runway, I kept watching. The figures did not step back. They did not shield their eyes. The lights passed them, and then they were behind us, swallowed by dark again. When the plane lifted, the engine screaming, I expected some sign of reaction. There was none. They remained exactly as they were. Once we were airborne and climbing, the pilot finally let his shoulders drop. The storm closed around us quickly, clouds swallowing the view. The ground vanished. The village vanished. It felt like leaving something unfinished behind. During the flight, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. There were no ghosts in my explanation. No monsters. Only people. That made it worse. Later, after I reached Anchorage and the storm shut everything down for days, I started asking careful questions. Not directly about that village, just about winter practices in remote areas. About how communities protect themselves when supply lines break and weather traps them. What I learned came together slowly. In some places, when storms isolate a village for weeks, they ration everything. Food, fuel, movement. Outsiders become a risk, not because they are dangerous, but because they are unknown. They bring variables. Illness, need, obligation. There are also places where local patrols watch the airstrip during storms. Not official. Just people making sure nothing lands that should not. Making sure no one arrives when there is no capacity to take them in. Making sure departures happen cleanly. The movement I saw was likely people testing the edge of the light, checking sight lines, making sure the plane was real and not something else. The still figures were a final confirmation. Witnesses. A record that the last flight left before isolation began. The warning not to wave made sense too. A wave is a greeting. A greeting invites response. Response creates connection. Connection creates responsibility. In a storm that could kill, responsibility had to be controlled. The pilot knew this. He had flown there before. He knew the rules that were never written down. The village was quiet because it had already turned inward. Doors closed. Fires banked. Everyone where they needed to be. I was allowed to leave because I was already scheduled. Already accounted for. Already someone else's problem once the wheels left the ground. What stays with me is not fear of the dark or the figures. It is the precision of it, the discipline, the way human behavior, under enough pressure, can become as rigid and silent as anything imagined. There was nothing supernatural on that runway. Just people doing what they believed was necessary to survive winter in a place that does not forgive mistakes. I still think about how close I came to breaking that unspoken rule. How a simple raised hand could have changed the story into something much harder to explain. The storm closed the region for nearly 3 weeks. No flights in or out. When service resumed, the airstrip returned to normal. Lights on. Tracks in the snow. No sign that anything unusual had ever happened there. But I know what I saw, and I understand why no one wanted me to acknowledge it. I was never meant to. My brother built his cabin with his own hands on a bench above a frozen slough on the Kenai Peninsula. He chose the spot because it was quiet and because the spruce broke the wind. He cut the logs in summer, dragged them with a borrowed winch, notched them slow and careful. He lived there year-round. He trusted winter more than people. We kept in touch by radio when the snow closed the roads. Short check-ins every few days. Weather, fuel, traps. Then the radio went quiet. February 2002 was hard cold. The kind that makes metal complain and keeps breath hanging. After a week with no response, I loaded my snowmobile and went in. I followed the old trail along the river, then cut uphill through timber. The forest was tight and dark. Snow had crusted on top from a thaw and refreeze. My machine cut a clean line, and the sound carried too far. I kept stopping the engine to listen. Nothing answered back. No birds. No wind. I reached the clearing near dusk. The cabin sat where it always did, low and square, smoke stacked black against pale sky. No smoke. That was the first wrong thing. He kept the stove going even when he went out for the day. I shut down the machine, and the quiet pressed in. My ears rang. I could hear my heart. The door was shut. The window shutters were closed. Snow had drifted against the north wall, but the front was clear. I tried the handle. It did not move. The deadbolt was thrown from inside. I went around and checked the back door. Same. I leaned close to the window and scraped frost with my glove. The glass was clear enough to see the table. His pack sat where he left it. His parka hung on the peg. Nothing looked disturbed. I circled the cabin and saw the path. It ran between the treeline and the cabin, 10 steps from the wall. A groove worn down through the crust, through powder, to old hard snow. Back and forth. Straight lines with tight turns. Not the looping arcs of an animal. Not the scatter of tracks you see when something sniffs and circles. This was pacing. Deliberate. The ends of the path were squared off as if whoever made it stopped, turned, and went back the same way. The stride length was even. Boots, not paws. I stood there a long time looking at it. My breath fogged my goggles and froze. I did not step into the path. I followed it with my eyes. It stopped short of the front steps. It never touched the door. I forced the window open and climbed in. The cabin smelled like cold wood and old smoke. The stove was cold to the touch. Ashes sat undisturbed. The kettle was empty. Food was laid out on the counter, cans lined up, bread wrapped. Nothing spoiled. Time had stopped. His boots were by the door, toes pointing out like he had kicked them off. He never went outside without them. I checked the bunks. His bed was made. I checked the radio. Power was on. The dial was where it always was. I called his call sign. Static. I tried again. Static. The battery was full. I listened. Nothing broke through. I barred the window and slid the bolt on the door. I fed the stove and got a fire going. The wood popped and settled. The cabin warmed slow. Darkness came early. I ate a cold meal because I did not want to leave the room to cook. I kept seeing the path when I closed my eyes. The straightness of it, the patience it implied. I checked outside before bed. Moonlight made the snow bright and hard. The path lay clean and sharp. No new tracks crossed it. The trees stood still. I did not see anyone. I went back in and banked the fire. I lay on my brother's bunk with my boots on and my parka zipped. The sound came after the fire burned low. A pressure, not a thud. Wood creaked along the wall behind my head. The logs bowed enough to make the chinking sigh. The whole cabin leaned for a moment, then settled back. I did not hear steps. I did not hear approach or retreat. Only the weight. I counted my breaths. I did not move. I held the rifle across my chest and stared at the wall until the dark thinned. Nothing else happened. Dawn came gray and flat. I went outside. The path was deeper. Fresh edges. It ended where it always did. Close, but not close enough to touch the cabin. No other tracks. No signs of struggle. No blood. No drag marks. Just the same waiting line. I left at sunrise. I did not check the river. I did not look for him. I followed my own trail back out and did not stop until the trees opened. The official story came later. A fall through river ice. It fit the season and the place. People nodded. Accidents happen. They wanted to form a search party. I said no. I said it would be dangerous. I did not explain why. I did not tell them about the path or the weight on the wall. Here is what I believe happened and why I never went back. My brother had been watched. Not by an animal, by a person who knew how to move in winter and how to wait. Someone who did not want to be seen at the door. Someone who paced to keep warm and close. The locks thrown from inside mean my brother closed himself in because he knew someone was there. He did not leave his boots because he went out. He left them because he never got the chance. He may have been taken when he stepped out earlier, down by the river where sound carries and trees block sight. The pacing was after, waiting for him to come back, waiting for night to thin courage. The pressure on the wall was not a bear testing logs. Bears do not pace neat lines. They do not lean and listen. It was a person putting weight on the cabin to feel for life inside, to test fear, to know if someone was awake. When I was there, I became the thing inside the box. The path deepened because the waiting continued. People ask why no tracks led away. Winter hides exits. Wind viel springs. Time erases. What it does not erase is intent. The path showed that. Straight. Even. Patient. I refused the search because I understood then that the cabin was not the danger. The person who had learned it was. They had stayed close without being seen. They had returned. They would return again. I was not willing to lead anyone back into a place where someone knew the ground better than us and had already chosen to wait rather than act. The cabin still stands. Snow will keep covering the path and uncovering it again. Officially, my brother fell through ice. Unofficially, I left something behind that night that had nothing to do with him. I left certainty. I left trust in empty places. I left at sunrise because whatever leaned into the wall had learned the sound of my breathing, and I was not going to give it another night to listen. I went to Alaska for work because I had run out of reasons to stay anywhere else. I was 26, short on money, and carrying a debt that kept gaining weight no matter how much I paid. The contract was for 6 months maintaining industrial refrigeration for a seafood distributor that stored crab and pollock before shipping south. The pay was higher than anything I had seen, and the listing warned about winter conditions in plain language. No exaggeration. No comfort. I accepted within an hour. I arrived outside Fairbanks in early January. The sky had a dull blue color that never quite turned into daylight. The air felt dry and sharp, like breathing through cracked glass. At -40, the cold does not wrap around you. It presses inward. Every exposed surface feels thin. The sound of my boots on packed snow rang louder than it should have. The first thing I learned was that cold changes how noise moves. It makes small sounds carry and soft sounds disappear. The job itself was simple. Walk the yard. Check pressures. Inspect seals. Clear frost buildup. Keep generators ready in case power dropped. The storage yard sat off an unnamed industrial road with no houses nearby. Just gravel, steel, and snow pushed into tall banks by a loader. Rows of freezer units stood like shipping containers with pipes running overhead. A small office trailer sat near the gate. Most nights I worked with another tech, but staffing was thin and alarms went to whoever was closest. That night I was alone. The alarm came in a little after midnight. A motion sensor alert at the cold storage yard. I drove out in a company truck that rattled when the heater fan kicked on. The road was empty. My headlights cut tunnels through the dark, and snow dust hung in the air from my own tires. When I reached the yard, the floodlights were on. That was normal for an alarm. The gate stood open the same way it always was. The office trailer was dark. No sign of anyone inside. I parked near the generator shed and shut the engine off. The silence after was complete and heavy. My ears rang from it. I stepped out, and the cold hit my face hard enough to make my eyes water. My breath came out in thick clouds that drifted sideways and vanished. I checked the control panel on the outside of the generator housing. No fault lights. Fuel level good. Oil pressure normal. The generator had not failed. I logged the readings by habit, and then started walking the perimeter of the freezers to look for the cause of the motion alert. My headlamp threw a narrow beam across the snow. The surface looked smooth except for wind ripples and my own tracks from earlier visits. Then I saw another set of prints crossing between 2 units. They were wide, wider than my boots. They pressed deep into the snow, deeper than mine despite me carrying tools. There was no tread pattern, just a flat oval shape with a slight curve at the front. I followed them for a few steps and then stopped. They did not lead to any door. They curved around the back of the units and continued on. I told myself they belonged to a worker from an earlier shift wearing soft boots. Felt Saul's leave little pattern. That made sense. I kept moving. As I rounded the next row, I noticed the prints again. Same width. Same depth. They circled the freezers at a steady distance, keeping to the shadows cast by the units. They never approached the access panels or the doors. They did not overlap my tracks. They were clean and spaced evenly, as if whoever made them was not in a hurry. The cold made my fingers clumsy even through gloves. I adjusted my headlamp and checked another sensor box. No damage. No loose wires. I logged another note and turned toward the far end of the yard. That was when I heard the breathing. It was low and slow, coming from behind the units ahead of me. Not loud, just present. Each breath had a wet edge to it, like air moving through a narrow space. It was steady, with long pauses between breaths, as if whatever was making the sound was conserving effort. It did not sound panicked or strained. It sounded patient. I stopped walking. The beam of my headlamp rested on a patch of snow between steel walls. The breathing continued. I could not tell how far away it was. Sound flattened in the cold. It might have been 10 feet or 50. I stood there longer than I should have. My heart thudded hard enough to feel in my throat. I told myself it was a machine cycling, a pressure release, wind moving through a gap. None of those fit the rhythm. I took one step back. The snow creaked under my boot. The breathing did not change. I reached up to adjust my headlamp again, and my gloved hand slipped. The light went out. The darkness was complete. The yard lights did not reach between the units. My world shrank to the sound of my own breath and the blood rushing in my ears. The breathing stopped instantly. The silence after felt intentional, like a response. I froze. I did not move. My lungs burned as I held my breath without meaning to. I waited for the sound to return. It did not. I waited for footsteps. Nothing. I turned the headlamp back on with shaking fingers. The beam cut through the dark and landed on empty snow. No movement. No shape. The prints were still there, circling away into shadow. I finished my checks fast after that. I did not follow the prints again. I did not walk the full perimeter. I checked the last sensor panel from a distance and logged it as clear. My hands ached from the cold, and my jaw hurt from clenching it. When I reached the truck, I did not look back at the units. I started the engine and drove out with the headlights fixed straight ahead. The road felt longer on the way back. I kept expecting to see something in the mirrors. I did not check them. The next morning I filed my report and mentioned the motion alert with no fault found. I did not include the prints or the breathing. I told myself I had imagined those parts. Lack of sleep and cold do strange things. Later that day my supervisor pulled me aside. He had been with the company for decades and looked like the cold had shaped his face. He asked about the alarm. I told him it showed a motion trigger. He frowned and shook his head. That system had been disconnected years earlier after too many false alerts from wildlife. The wiring had been left in place, but it was dead. No signal should have come through. We checked the logs. The alert had originated from a secondary sensor tied to a standalone battery unit installed during an equipment trial. It had been forgotten when the trial ended. It still had power. That explained the alert. It did not explain the rest. A week later, a wildlife officer came by asking about tracks near the yard. A bull moose had been moving through industrial areas looking for packed snow and windbreaks. The prints matched what I had seen. Wide, deep, no tread. Moose often circle objects before bedding down, using structures to block wind. The breathing could have been the animal standing still behind the units, resting and conserving heat. At -40, even large animals move slowly. The officer mentioned that moose sometimes stop breathing for short periods when they sense danger, freezing in place. The cold air can make their breath visible and audible in strange ways. Sound carries and vanishes without warning. The explanation fit every piece of it. The prints, the pattern, the breathing, the sudden silence when the light went out. The motion sensor triggered by a large warm body moving near the units. Nothing supernatural. Nothing impossible. I finished my contract. I did my job well. I did not take night calls alone after that unless I had to. The yard stayed quiet the rest of winter. Even now, years later, I remember how that breathing sounded. Not threatening, not angry, just steady and patient, like something that knew the cold better than I ever would and had all the time in the world to wait. I went north in early June when the sun stopped setting and time lost its edges. The job was simple on paper. Flag proposed line corridors across tundra so engineers could decide if a pipeline made sense. I had done similar work in the lower 48, but nothing prepares you for the North Slope. There are no trees to lean against your sense of scale. The land looks flat until you walk it and realize every step is a small fight. Wet ground hides under a skin of green. Wind never stops moving. The air tastes clean and metallic at the same time. 3 of us were flown in by bush plane with food and fuel for 10 days. The pilot circled once and dropped us near a low rise beside a shallow braided stream. The plane left and the sound drained out of the world. We set up camp fast because weather can turn without warning. Tents went up, bare fence around the food cache, tripods for the GPS units, and bundles of bright survey tape tied to fiberglass stakes. The tape was our work and our map. We measured, flagged, logged coordinates, then moved on. The routine kept the mind busy. By day 4 the small things started to feel wrong. The first sign was a flag on a slope west of camp. We had tied it low and loose to account for wind. When we came back through to confirm spacing, the tape was higher and pulled tight, knotted clean with the tail trimmed. It was not torn or chewed. The stake was in the same place. It had been moved with care. We laughed because laughing is easier than thinking about who else might be out there. We told ourselves it was another crew passing through, or a curious hunter fixing sloppy work. There was no reason to believe otherwise. Food started going missing that night. Not random food. The same items every time. Salt packets from the ration box. Jerky sticks. Coffee. Nothing else touched. No cans bent. No bags torn. The bare fence stayed intact. Tracks around the cache were shallow and confused, like the ground had been pressed by boots and then softened again. We blamed each other in our heads and never said it out loud. Accusations would not help. We tightened routines and counted items. The losses continued at the same slow pace. Sleep on the slope is strange. The light never leaves, so the body forgets when to rest. I slept with my hood pulled tight to block the sky. One night, I woke to the sound of someone near my tent. Not footsteps. Breath and a low whisper shaped like my name. The voice was familiar enough that my first thought was to answer, then the second thought hit, and I froze. The voice matched one of my co-workers. He was asleep 6 feet away in his own tent. I could hear his breathing through the fabric. The whisper repeated once and stopped. No fabric moved. No shadow crossed the wall. When I checked later, there were no fresh prints by my door. I lay awake until my eyes burned. The next morning the land looked the same as always, which made it worse. We worked without talking about the night. We followed the line east and found 2 more flags altered the same way as the first. Higher, tighter, neat. It felt like someone was correcting us. When we returned to camp, the coffee was gone again. The jar sat empty and clean, lid screwed back on. That detail stuck with me. Animals do not do that. We decided to cut the job short. Not because of fear, but because our data was compromised. Flags moved meant measurements could not be trusted. Missing food meant ration math broke down. We packed with care and set signal panels near the landing area for pickup. Weather delayed the plane, so we waited 2 more nights. During those nights, I noticed flashes on the far ridge after the sun dipped low. Brief white glints that looked like mirrors catching light. They came from different points and never stayed long. I assumed it was our own gear reflecting from odd angles until the last night, when the flashes appeared in a line that traced the route we had flagged. When the plane finally came back, the pilot circled twice. We loaded fast. As we lifted off, he leaned out and scanned the ground, then looked back at us with a puzzled face. He later asked why we had been signaling with mirrors at night. None of us had brought mirrors. None of us had been out after setting camp. The explanation came weeks later when the report landed on my desk. Another contractor had been working a seismic survey 50 miles west and had sent a 2-person scout team ahead to assess ground conditions. They were delayed by weather and moved east on foot to rendezvous with a different pickup zone. They carried no radios to save weight, only GPS units and signal mirrors for aircraft. They followed our flagged corridor because it offered clear travel and accurate bearings. They tightened flags to mark their path back and conserve tape. They took salt and coffee to replace what their storm-soaked packs had ruined. They mirrored signals at night when the sun angle allowed, because it was the only way to be seen by a plane passing high and far. The whisper had a simpler cause that still makes my skin crawl. One of the scouts had learned my name from a tag on a ration box. He had called out quietly to avoid startling a bear he thought was near our camp. He had mimicked my co-worker's voice after hearing it earlier, thinking it would be less alarming. He realized his mistake and left without waiting for a response. Everything fit. Human choices, bad timing, thin margins. No ghosts. No creatures. Just people crossing paths in a place too big for mistakes. Knowing that did not erase the memory of waking to my name in the endless light, or the feeling of being corrected by unseen hands. The North Slope does not need anything unreal to be frightening. It only needs distance, weather, and the knowledge that someone can be right there without you knowing, doing careful work that touches yours, then slipping away. I drove north alone, because that was the point. August in Alaska still held long light, but the nights were beginning to remember darkness. I wanted storms. I wanted the kind that roll in without asking, the kind that scrape the land raw. The Denali Highway was gravel and dust and silence, stretching between low tundra and distant mountains that looked close until you tried to reach them. Mile 47 was nothing special on a map. It was just a pull-out where the ground dipped enough to hide a vehicle from the road. I parked with the nose facing out. Old habit. I checked the wind, the clouds, the smell of the air. There was metal in it, like rain mixed with cold stone. The sky had stacked itself into layers, low and thick, moving faster than they should have. I took my pack and camera and walked away from the road until the sound of tires no longer existed. The ground was spongy tundra, dotted with rocks and short brush. Each step made a soft sucking sound. I went about a mile in, far enough that the road felt imaginary. I set camp early because the light changed fast. The wind came in pulses, not steady, pushing at my shoulders like a test. I pitched the tent low, weighted the corners with stones, checked the stakes twice. The land felt open in a way that made me aware of my own shape. There were no trees tall enough to break the view, just rolling ground and sky pressing down. I ate a cold meal and drank water that tasted faintly of plastic. I took a few photos of the clouds building over the range. The light went flat, then bruised purple. Thunder stayed far away, but the air hummed like it was thinking about it. By the time I crawled into the tent, the wind had settled into a steady shove. The fabric snapped and relaxed over and over. Sleep came in pieces. I would drift, then wake, then drift again. Around midnight, the sound began. It was not sudden. It started as pressure, the sense that something had entered the space around me. Then I heard steps. Not quick, not light. They moved slow and even circling. Each step compressed the ground with weight. I could hear the tundra give way under it. The rhythm stayed the same, one step after another, never closer, never farther. My first thought was bear, but the pattern did not fit. Bears shuffle. They pause. They sniff. This movement was deliberate, like walking a fence line. I could picture the circle tightening, then realized it never did. It stayed just beyond the reach of my hand, through the tent wall. I shouted once, loud and sharp, the sound breaking the night. The wind carried it away. Nothing ran. Nothing crashed off. The steps stopped as if someone had turned off a switch. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I waited for breath, for a snort, for any sign of an animal reacting. There was none. Time stretched. I sat upright, listening so hard my ears rang. The wind kept moving. The clouds slid past the moon and uncovered it again. I did not hear steps return, but I did not sleep. My body stayed tight, ready for impact that never came. At some point I noticed another sound, low and steady, coming from the ground itself. It matched the rise and fall of something heavy resting nearby. It was not loud. It was not close enough to touch. It was present enough to feel. Morning came gray and cold. When the light finally filled the tent, I unzipped the door and stepped out. The ground around the tent was pressed flat in a wide ring. The tundra crushed down smooth as if something had laid its full weight there and rested. The circle was even almost careful. There were no tracks leading in. There were no tracks leading out. No scat. No fur. No torn plants beyond the ring. The rest of the land looked untouched. I stood there longer than I should have, turning in place, trying to make sense of it. Wind can flatten grass, but not like that. Not in a clean circle. Not overnight. I packed without eating. My hands shook as I rolled the tent and stuffed it into the bag. I kept scanning the horizon, expecting movement that never appeared. The walk back to the road felt longer. Every dip in the ground looked like a place something could rise from. When the gravel came into view, relief hit hard and fast. I loaded the car and drove a short distance before pulling over to calm down. Another vehicle was parked there, a photographer I recognized by the gear spread on the tailgate. We exchanged nods. As we packed up, he mentioned, without prompting, the sound from the night. He described breathing, slow and steady, lasting for hours. He asked if I had heard it too. I did not answer him directly. I finished loading and left. Later, back home, I went through the photos. The storm shots were fine. The clouds looked heavy and real. Nothing unusual showed up. I did research instead. I read about bull musk ox bedding down in wind, about how their bodies can press tundra flat when they rest in a group. I read about how their tracks can vanish in soft ground when conditions are right, how wind and moisture can erase signs by morning. I read about how sound carries strange in open land, how breathing can travel low and far. The explanation fit enough to let me sleep again. A lone musk ox or a small group could have moved through without leaving clear tracks, settled around the tent for shelter from the wind, then moved on before dawn. The even ring made sense if more than one animal had laid down, bodies close, heat shared. The lack of scat could be timing. The stillness after my shout could be an animal freezing rather than fleeing. What stayed with me was not fear of something unknown. It was the realization of how small my presence was out there, how easily something heavy and alive could move around me without caring who I was. Alaska felt honest because it did not adjust itself for people. It did not announce intentions. It did not explain itself in ways meant to comfort. I have not camped alone that far off the road since. I still photograph storms. I still drive north. I just keep more distance between myself and the open ground, and I listen more carefully to what the land is already doing before I decide to stay. My name is Mark H. In March of 2016, I was driving fuel trucks on the Dalton Highway. Nights only. That was the schedule I asked for and the one they gave me. Less traffic. Fewer tourists. Fewer plows stopping and starting. It was easier to keep a rhythm when the road stayed empty and black. The Dalton at night is not like other highways. It is not a road you drive through. It is a surface you balance on. Ice packed hard by studs and chains. Snow polished into a dull sheen. On clear nights the sky drops low and feels close enough to touch. On bad nights the dark presses in from every side and erases distance. Headlights carve a narrow tunnel. Everything outside that beam might as well not exist. The truck was a standard fuel hauler. Long nose, heavy tank, chains humming through the frame, diesel heat roaring under the cab. The engine noise never stopped. It settled into your bones and stayed there even when you shut it off. I drove steady and slow. No sudden moves. No hard braking. On ice you treat momentum like a loaded weapon. I worked nights because I slept better during the day in Dead Horse and Coldfoot. I liked knowing what was ahead of me. In daylight you see everything, and your brain tries to name it. At night you just drive. The radio was my only connection to anything outside the cab. Company frequency. Dispatch. Weather updates. Other drivers checking mile markers. Most of the time it was quiet. Static and the low hiss of an open channel. That was fine. Silence was part of the job. The first time the breathing came through I was northbound, just past the Yukon River. I had slowed to take a long curve that dipped and rose again. As soon as my speed dropped the radio changed. The hiss thickened. Something else came in under it. Slow air movement. Close. Like someone breathing through their nose inches from a microphone. It was not loud. It did not crackle. It had shape. In and out. Wet at the edges. I waited for it to resolve into words or feedback. It did not. When I eased back onto the throttle the sound thinned and vanished. Just static again. I told myself it was interference. Cold does strange things to electronics. I had heard worse. The radio had been dropped more than once. Antennas iced over. No reason to think about it. It happened again the next night at almost the same spot. I slowed for the same curve. The same breathing slid into the channel. Low. Steady. Too close for comfort. When I sped up it went away. After that I started paying attention. It only happened when I slowed down. Not at stops. Not at idle. Only when the truck was moving but creeping. Curves. Hills. Narrow stretches where the road crowned high and fell away on both sides. Dispatch logged nothing unusual. The signal strength stayed normal. No other drivers reported anything. I stopped mentioning it. Fatigue does not feel like falling asleep at the wheel. It feels like small errors stacking up. A missed reflection. A delay between thought and action. I drank coffee and chewed jerky. I cracked the window to let the cold bite my face. The road stayed straight. The miles rolled by. The night I saw the figure was clear and bitter. The temperature sat well below zero. The stars were sharp. The headlights reached far. I was southbound, empty tank, lighter on the axles. I was making good time. The road ahead dipped slightly and then leveled out. At the far edge of my lights, something stood in the lane. At first it looked like a trick of shadow, a smear of dark against darker ground. As I got closer, it resolved into a shape with height, taller than a man, too thin to be a moose. Upright, still. I did not brake. Braking hard on ice can put you sideways. Swerving can be worse. My hands stayed where they were. I held the line and kept the speed steady. As the distance closed, my mind tried to label it. A person made no sense. No reflective gear. No vehicle. No movement. An animal would move. Even in cold. Even stunned. This thing did not. The radio filled with the breathing as I eased off the throttle, just enough to keep control. It was louder this time. Closer. I could hear moisture in it. I could hear weight. The headlights washed over the spot. For a fraction of a second there was nothing there. Then the truck shuddered. Not a bump. Not a slide. A solid jolt that ran up through the steering column and into my shoulders, like hitting packed snow or ice debris at speed. I kept driving. I did not stop. I did not look back. I waited for alarms, for pressure drops, for the feel of a damaged tire. None came. The smell hit seconds later. It came through the vents. Thick and wrong. Wet fur. Rotting meat. A sour edge that burned the back of my throat. It did not smell like roadkill. It did not smell like fuel. It smelled alive and dead at the same time. I shut the vents and switched to recirculation. It stayed. It clung to the fabric of the seat, to my jacket, to my hair. I gagged and focused on the road. I drove the rest of the run with the windows cracked despite the cold. The breathing did not come back. The radio stayed silent. The smell stayed with me until I reached the yard. Under the lights, I walked the length of the truck. No damage. No blood. No hair. No sign of impact. The undercarriage was clean. The tires intact. The bumper unmarked. I scrubbed the cab. I aired it out. By morning the smell had faded but not gone. It lingered like a memory. In the days that followed, I thought about what it could have been. The Dalton cuts through migration routes. Caribou cross the road in lines that stretch for miles. Wolves trail them. A wolf with mange can look thin and tall. Standing broadside in headlights can play tricks on depth. Hitting ice chunks kicked up by plows can shake a truck hard. Cold air can carry smells far. Animal musk can get pulled into an intake and linger. Radio interference can pick up open mics. Breathing can be someone leaning near a handset hundreds of miles away. Slowing changes signal behavior. None of that is impossible. What stayed with me was the timing. The way it only came when I slowed. The way the shape did not move. The way the smell filled a sealed cab with no trace left behind. I finished my shifts. I did my inspections. I did not slow down more than I had to. The breathing came back twice more in different stretches. Always the same. Always gone when I sped up. Sleep got worse. I dreamed of the road narrowing until there was no shoulder. Of headlights stopping just short of something I could not see. I woke with the smell in my nose. 2 weeks after the impact, I turned in my notice. No drama. No explanation beyond fatigue. They nodded and took my badge. Someone else took my route the next night. The schedule rolled on. I drove south and did not look back. Years later, I still think about that night when I smell wet fur or old meat. I have read reports about animals on the Dalton, about optical illusions in polar light, about how cold air bends sound and pulls it close. Everything has an explanation if you line it up right. I know what I felt through the wheel. I know what filled my cab. I know that nothing was there when I stopped. That road does not care what you believe. It does not warn you. It lets you pass and keeps what it wants. I left before it asked again.